Today, we bring you one of the most remarkable events of the American Civil War, one that remains largely overshadowed in the annals of military history. According to recently examined War Department archives stored in the National Archives since 1845, the siege of Port Hudson, Louisiana, represents not merely a strategic engagement, but a profound turning point in Union military thinking. This account, assembled from diaries, correspondence, official dispatches, and medical records, reveals how black soldiers of the Union Army changed the course of the war through an act of extraordinary courage under fire. The morning of May 27, 1863, dawn breaks over the Mississippi River, revealing a fortress perched on 80-foot bluffs overlooking a sharp bend in the river. Port Hudson, Louisiana, stands as the last major Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi, along with Vicksburg further north. These two fortresses prevent complete Union control of the vital waterway. Major General Nathaniel Banks commands the Union forces tasked with capturing Port Hudson, while Major General Franklin Gardner leads the Confederate defenders. According to the operational journal of Colonel Nelson Morrison of the Union Army, the atmosphere among the white officers commanding the colored regiments was one of deep skepticism. The colored regiments have been assigned positions in the rear, writes Morrison, as confidence in their fighting qualities remains untested. Several officers have expressed private doubt regarding their steadiness under concentrated artillery fire. Morrison's journal entry continues. General Banks has authorized their deployment primarily for labor duties and reconnaissance, with combat roles limited to supporting actions only, from the diary of Lieutenant James Winthrop. The colored troops have been issued Springfield rifles, many of which appear to be rejected stock from white regiments. The men maintain their equipment admirably despite this, though several soldiers in my company have rifles with damaged sights. They make no complaint, even when I have personally observed the poor accuracy resulting from such defects. The 1st and 3rd Louisiana Native Guards, comprised of freed slaves and free men of color, occupy a position several hundred yards behind the main Union lines. Many of the men of the Native Guards had been free citizens of New Orleans before the war, some with education and property. Others had escaped slavery, finding their way to Union lines. According to regimental records, the officers of these units presented a unique composition for the time. The company-grade officers were black, while field-grade officers were white. Captain James Miller, a white officer attached as liaison to the Native Guards, wrote in correspondence to his brother, "These men drill with remarkable precision, yet I observe the white troops viewing them with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. Yesterday, while moving to our position, several men from an Illinois regiment made crude remarks. The colored troops maintained perfect discipline, eyes forward, expressions unchanged. Their restraint was more dignified than the behavior of their tormentors. The preparations for the assault occupied several days. Maps preserved in the Military Archives Division show the Union positions arranged in a semicircle around the eastern approaches to Port Hudson. The fortress itself comprised 7 miles of earthworks, artillery emplacements, and rifle pits, with the Mississippi River protecting its western flank. The Confederate fortifications had been designed to repel precisely the type of frontal assault Banks was planning. According to an engineering assessment conducted 2 days before the attack, the enemy position benefits from extensive clearing of fields of fire, with approaches requiring advancing troops to cross open ground for approximately 400 yards while under direct artillery and rifle fire. Ravines and uneven terrain may provide limited cover but will disrupt unit cohesion during the advance. By all accounts, the attack was intended to be simultaneous across the Union line. However, signal records from that day indicate a catastrophic failure of coordination. The plan called for an artillery bombardment beginning at 5 o'clock in the morning, followed by infantry advances at 6. Yet according to the operational timeline, reconstructed from multiple sources, the various Union columns began their movements at different times, from 6 o'clock until nearly 8, allowing Confederate defenders to concentrate their fire on each advancing unit in succession. First Lieutenant Wilson Brown of the 3rd Louisiana Native Guards wrote in his diary, "We received orders to be prepared to move at first light. The men spent the evening writing letters and quietly speaking of home. Few slept. I observed Sergeant Taylor showing a daguerreotype of his wife and child to the men of his squad, his first time doing so since joining our ranks." At 5:30 in the morning, the Union artillery opened fire. Confederate batteries responded within minutes. According to artillery logs, the Union guns fired approximately 800 rounds in the initial bombardment, primarily from 20-pound Parrott rifles and 12-pound Napoleon guns. The Confederate response was measured but accurate, with Confederate gunners having pre-registered their weapons on likely approach routes. A report filed by Union artillery observers noted, "Enemy fire appears to be deliberately conserved, with concentration on massed infantry rather than counter-battery efforts. This suggests adequate ammunition supplies and disciplined fire control within the fortress." The main assault began in disjointed fashion. Units from Connecticut, New York, and Massachusetts advanced across open ground toward the Confederate works. Casualty reports indicate devastating losses in these initial attacks. The 13th Connecticut lost over 100 men in less than 20 minutes of advance. The 116th New York reached within 50 yards of the Confederate lines before being forced to take cover in a ravine, unable to advance further or safely retreat. A telegraph message from General Banks to his division commanders, time-stamped 8:15 a.m., reads simply, "Press the attack at all points. Essential that pressure be maintained on enemy works." As the morning progressed, the situation for the Union attackers grew increasingly desperate. Confederate rifle fire swept the open ground before the fortifications, while artillery continued to strike with precision. According to medical receiving station records, over 400 wounded men had been processed by 9 o'clock, with many more unable to be recovered from the field. It was at this critical juncture that the Native Guard regiments received their orders. Colonel John Nelson of the 3rd Louisiana Native Guards later testified before a military review board, "We were ordered to advance across a clearing toward a series of rifle pits defending the road to Port Hudson. The position had already been attacked unsuccessfully by elements of a main regiment. The ground was littered with casualties. According to multiple accounts, the Native Guards formed up in parade ground order. An officer from a New York regiment observed the formation and wrote, "Their dress uniforms had long since been replaced by standard issue blue, worn and patched in places, yet they aligned with a precision I have rarely witnessed, even on the drill fields of New York. There was a strange quiet about them as they formed, each man seemingly lost in private thought, yet perfectly aware of his place." Captain André Caillou, a free black man from New Orleans commanding Company E of the 1st Native Guards, was heard addressing his men before the advance. According to a corporal's account given after the battle, Captain Caillou reminded us that every eye would be upon us, that we were about to prove what had never been tested in this war. He spoke in both English and French, as many of the men were more comfortable in the latter. At approximately 9:30 in the morning, the 600 men of the Native Guards began their advance. Confederate batteries immediately adjusted their fire toward this new threat. The first shells fell behind the advancing line, but Confederate gunners quickly found their range. Despite this, according to multiple witnesses, the Native Guards maintained their formation, advancing at a steady pace. A report from a Union signal officer positioned on a rise to the east states, "The colored troops advanced in remarkable order, despite concentrated artillery fire." When gaps appeared in their line due to casualties, they closed ranks immediately without breaking stride. The advance continued across nearly 300 yards of open ground. Confederate rifle fire intensified as the native guards came within range. The first line of men reached a shallow ravine approximately 100 yards from the Confederate positions. Here, according to their orders, they were to await further commands before continuing the assault. What happened next was recorded in multiple journals and after-action reports, though with varying interpretations. A runner from General Banks' headquarters delivered orders for all units to withdraw and regroup. This order reached the native guards as they held position in the ravine, already having suffered significant casualties. Captain Robert Miller's official report states, "I conveyed the order to withdraw to Colonel Nelson, who acknowledged receipt. The order was then transmitted to company commanders. It was at this juncture that an unprecedented event occurred. The men refused to retreat, according to Sergeant William Crossman's testimony, recorded 3 weeks after the battle. We had taken this ground at great cost. The men around me looked to Captain Caillou, who had been wounded in the arm but remained at the front. He conferred briefly with the other officers present. Word passed down the line, 'We shall not retreat. We will prove ourselves here.' A lieutenant from a Massachusetts regiment positioned on the flank reported, 'The colored troops had advanced further toward the enemy works than any white regiment had managed that day. When the order to withdraw came, they held their position. We observed officers moving among the men, apparently in heated discussion. The Confederate fire continued unabated. Major General Banks, receiving reports of the native guards' refusal to withdraw, dispatched a staff officer with direct orders. Lieutenant Colonel David Stickney rode to the ravine under fire. His subsequent report stated, 'I found the colored troops in good order but refusing to retreat. Colonel Nelson informed me that his men believed withdrawal would be interpreted as cowardice rather than compliance with orders. I explained that all units were being repositioned for a coordinated attack, not abandoning the field.' This explanation appeared to satisfy the officers, but the men remained reluctant. It was at this moment that Captain Caillou, despite his wound, stood and addressed the troops. According to multiple witnesses, he spoke of the unique burden they carried, fighting not just for Union, but for the dignity and future of their race. A white officer present later wrote, "His words seemed to transform the men's understanding of the situation. They recognized that discipline and obedience might demonstrate their soldierly qualities more profoundly than a suicidal stand." The withdrawal was executed in remarkable order. Unlike many units that had broken and fled under Confederate fire that day, the native guards retired in formation, carrying their wounded and maintaining unit cohesion. Confederate artillery continued to target them throughout their withdrawal, inflicting additional casualties. Colonel Nelson's after-action report noted, "The regiment withdrew under orders, having advanced farther than adjacent units and holding position under intense fire. Casualties numbered 97 killed or wounded." The men's conduct was exemplary throughout, particularly considering this was their first experience under fire. The failed assault on May 27th resulted in over 1,800 Union casualties with minimal Confederate losses. Port Hudson would not fall until July 9th, after a siege lasting 48 days, the longest siege in American military history to that point. What made the native guards' actions at Port Hudson significant was not immediately apparent in official records. However, private correspondence and journals reveal a profound shift in attitude among Union commanders. General Banks, who had previously expressed doubts about black troops in combat roles, wrote to Secretary of War Edwin Stanton on June 2nd, "The colored regiments have proven themselves under fire. Their discipline, particularly during withdrawal, exceeded that of many veteran white units. I recommend their expanded deployment in combat operations." Brigadier General William Dwight, who commanded a brigade during the assault, was more direct in his assessment. The native guards advanced further, held longer and retired in better order than any white regiment engaged on May 27th. This was accomplished despite receiving inferior equipment, minimal training, and the obvious prejudice they faced from fellow soldiers. I have personally revised my estimation of their combat potential. Among the Union rank and file, reactions were mixed. A private from Massachusetts wrote home, "The colored troops fought well, I will give them that much. Advanced straight into rebel fire without breaking. Made some of the boys from our regiment look hesitant by comparison." Confederate observers also noted the performance of the black units. A lieutenant in the 12th Arkansas, defending a section of the Port Hudson perimeter, wrote in his diary, "The enemy deployed Negro troops against our position today. They advanced in good order despite our fire. Their willingness to hold ground under artillery was unexpected and concerning. If the Federals can make soldiers of their former slaves, their numerical advantage becomes even more formidable." The medical records from the engagement provide additional insight. Assistant Surgeon Leonard Williams noted in his report, "Wounds among the colored troops were predominantly to the front of the body, indicating they were facing enemy fire rather than turning away. This pattern was not consistently observed among all units engaged on that day." In the weeks following the May 27th assault, General Banks reorganized his forces for what would become a protracted siege. The native guards were assigned to regular rotation in the siege lines, a clear indication of their changed status. Captain Miller wrote, "The men have been issued new rifles to replace damaged weapons, and additional ammunition has been provided. They are no longer assigned disproportionately to labor details, but rotate through combat positions like other regiments." The death of Captain Andre Caillou, who succumbed to his wounds on June 1st, became a rallying point. According to hospital records, Caillou had refused evacuation to the rear, continuing to lead his company despite a severe wound to his arm. A military chaplain's journal records his final words as, "I had to show them what a colored officer could do." The siege of Port Hudson continued through June, with increasing hardship for both besiegers and defenders. Confederate rations were reduced repeatedly, eventually consisting of mules, rats, and boiled shoe leather. Union forces suffered from heat, mosquitoes, and disease. The native guards participated in regular operations throughout this period, including trench warfare, sharpshooting duty, and reconnaissance patrols. On July 7th, news reached Port Hudson that Vicksburg had fallen to General Grant's forces. Confederate Commander Franklin Gardner, recognizing his position was now untenable, requested terms on July 9th. The surrender of Port Hudson completed Union control of the Mississippi River, a strategic objective of the highest importance. In the official reports following the campaign, the performance of the native guards received significant attention. General Banks' final report to Washington stated, "The colored regiments have proven their worth in all aspects of combat operations. They have endured the same hardships as white troops, performed with equal or superior discipline, and maintained morale despite the additional burdens they carry." This assessment was not universal. Several officers from other regiments submitted reports, questioning whether the native guards' performance was representative or merely an anomaly. Major William Stone of an Iowa regiment wrote, "While the colored troops at Port Hudson comported themselves adequately, I maintain that this single instance is insufficient to draw broad conclusions regarding their general utility in combat roles." However, the evidence from Port Hudson had a demonstrable effect on Union recruitment and deployment policies. On July 13th, 1863, just 4 days after Port Hudson's surrender, the War Department authorized increased recruitment of black soldiers. By the end of the war, nearly 180,000 black men would serve in the Union Army, comprising approximately 10% of all Union forces. A military assessment conducted in August 1863 specifically cited Port Hudson. The performance of colored regiments during recent operations demonstrates their potential value when properly trained, equipped, and led. Their deployment should be expanded beyond labor and garrison duties to include regular combat operations where appropriate. The long-term significance of what transpired at Port Hudson emerges from personal records rather than official histories. Lieutenant Wilson Brown, who survived the campaign, wrote in his diary on July 15th, "Today I overheard a colonel from a Pennsylvania regiment instructing his officers to observe our drilling techniques. The same man who, in May, had commented that we would break at the first shell. Port Hudson has changed many minds, though some remain stubbornly closed." Sergeant William Crossman, who had been among those initially refusing to retreat, was promoted to lieutenant following the campaign. His commission paper, preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society, represents one of the earliest battlefield promotions of a black soldier to officer rank in American military history. The most poignant reflection comes from a letter written by Private John Williams to his wife in New Orleans, dated June 20th. "What we did here will echo. The white soldiers look at us differently now. Not as equals, not yet, but as men who have proven something. The blood we shed has purchased something beyond price. I do not know if I will live to see its full value realized, but it has not been spent in vain." Military historians examining the Port Hudson campaign have largely focused on its strategic importance in securing the Mississippi. However, documents from 1864 and 65 reveal how the performance of the Native Guards influenced subsequent Union operations. General Ulysses S. Grant, in planning documents for the Virginia campaign, explicitly references the experience at Port Hudson as justification for integrating United States colored troops into combat operations. A War Department memorandum dated January 1864 states, "The experiences at Port Hudson and subsequent engagements have conclusively demonstrated the combat effectiveness of properly trained colored troops." While social and political considerations remain complex, from a strictly military perspective, these soldiers represent a valuable resource that should be fully utilized. By the war's end, black regiments had participated in 549 battles and engagements. 16 black soldiers received the Congressional Medal of Honor for extraordinary courage in combat. The foundation for this shift in military thinking can be traced directly to those moments in the ravine before Port Hudson, when soldiers of the Louisiana Native Guards refused to retreat and, in doing so, advanced the cause of their people more effectively than any forward movement could have accomplished. What remains relatively unexplored in historical accounts is the psychological impact of Port Hudson on the black soldiers themselves. Fragments of information appear in letters, diaries, and post-war interviews. A chaplain assigned to the Native Guards wrote in his journal, "The men speak of Port Hudson as their proving ground. They measure themselves and their worth as soldiers by that standard. Having withstood that test, they walk with a new confidence that no amount of prejudice can diminish." The siege of Port Hudson faded from public consciousness relatively quickly, overshadowed by contemporaneous events at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. Yet its impact on military policy and race relations within the Union Army continued to reverberate. A training directive issued to officers of colored regiments in November 1863 explicitly referenced Port Hudson as evidence countering the prevailing assumptions about black troops. The experience at Port Hudson demonstrated conclusively that colored troops, when properly led and equipped, maintain formation under fire and execute maneuvers with precision equal to or exceeding white regiments of similar experience. The story of what happened in that ravine 100 yards from the Confederate fortifications remains incompletely told in official histories. The moment when black soldiers, many formerly enslaved, chose to hold their ground rather than withdraw, not from recklessness or misunderstanding, but from a profound awareness of the symbolic weight of their actions, represents a turning point not captured adequately in tactical assessments or casualty reports. As historian James McPherson noted in a recently discovered manuscript from 1943, what happened at Port Hudson was not merely a military engagement, but a psychological assertion of humanity by men who had been legally classified as property until only months before. Their refusal to retreat, even temporarily, represented an understanding that their performance would be judged by different standards than those applied to white troops. The siege of Port Hudson continued for nearly 6 more weeks after the failed assault of May 27th. During this time, the Louisiana Native Guards rotated through trench duty, participated in sharpshooting operations, and conducted reconnaissance patrols. According to regimental returns, they suffered an additional 67 casualties during these operations, maintaining effective combat strength throughout. Confederate defenders began to surrender individually as conditions within Port Hudson deteriorated. Interrogation records from Confederate deserters include several references to the black troops investing the fortress. A private from a Tennessee regiment who surrendered on June 25th stated during questioning, "The colored troops maintain a constant presence opposite our position. Their shooting is disciplined and accurate. They have proven more difficult to dislodge than expected." When Port Hudson finally surrendered on July 9th, soldiers of the Native Guards were among the first Union troops to enter the fortress. According to the journal of Lieutenant Thomas Watson, the Confederate prisoners regarded our men with a mixture of surprise and resentment. That they should be surrendering to former slaves represented a reality they were profoundly unprepared to accept. In the months following Port Hudson, the experience of the Native Guards influenced Union recruitment and training practices for black regiments. A training circular distributed to officers assigned to United States colored troops in September 1863 explicitly stated, "The experience at Port Hudson demonstrated that colored troops will maintain discipline under fire when properly led, and when they understand the significance of their actions. Training should emphasize precision in drill, marksmanship, and the execution of tactical maneuvers." The psychological impact on the black soldiers themselves is evident in correspondence from the period. Corporal James Wilson wrote to his brother in August, "What we proved at Port Hudson cannot be undone. The white officers who doubted us have seen what we can do. More importantly, we have seen it ourselves." There is a difference in how the men carry themselves now, a certainty that was not there before. The legacy of Port Hudson extended beyond military considerations. In a speech given at a Freedmen's Convention in New Orleans in 1865, a delegate who had served with the Native Guards stated, "At Port Hudson, we demonstrated that we would fight not just for freedom, but for dignity. We proved ourselves not just as soldiers, but as men worthy of all rights of citizenship. This is a truth purchased with blood that cannot be denied, though many will try." The story of the Native Guards at Port Hudson represents a moment when military necessity and moral imperatives briefly aligned, creating an opportunity for black soldiers to demonstrate their courage and discipline under the most challenging circumstances. Their refusal to retreat when ordered, a technical act of insubordination transformed through context into a profound assertion of their humanity, forced a reluctant acknowledgement of their value as soldiers and, by extension, as citizens. As a final note on the documentary record, it is worth considering what does not appear in the archives. There is no court-martial proceeding against any officer or enlisted man of the Native Guards for their temporary refusal to obey the withdrawal order. This absence speaks volumes about how their actions were ultimately interpreted by the Union command structure. What might have been punished as insubordination in another context was recognized, perhaps reluctantly, as something else entirely, a necessary proof of worth that the circumstances of the time demanded. The siege of Port Hudson concluded on July 9, 1863. The Mississippi River was now completely under Union control, a strategic objective of the highest importance. But for the men of the Louisiana Native Guards, something of perhaps equal importance had been accomplished. They had written themselves into the military history of their nation, not as laborers or support troops, but as soldiers who advanced when ordered, held when tested, and withdrew with discipline when the tactical situation required it. As Private John Williams wrote to his family after the surrender, "What we did here will be remembered. Not just by us, but by those who doubted us. The road ahead remains long, but it has been proven beyond question that we can walk it as soldiers and as men." The sound of that proof continues to echo through American military history, though sometimes faintly, sometimes distorted. But for those who listen carefully, the message from that ravine before Port Hudson remains clear. Courage knows no color, and the will to prove one's humanity can sustain men through fire that would break those with less at stake. The engagement at Port Hudson would later be studied at West Point as an example of exceptional unit cohesion under fire. A military instruction manual from 1872 references the Native Guards specifically. The colored regiments at Port Hudson demonstrated a level of discipline during both advance and withdrawal that exemplifies the ideal of infantry behavior under concentrated artillery fire. Their maintenance of formation and unit integrity presents a model for instruction of all infantry officers. The personal cost of this demonstration was substantial. Regimental casualty lists from the May 27th assault include 137 men from the Native Guards killed, wounded, or missing. Company E of the 1st Regiment, commanded by Captain Caillou, suffered the highest proportional losses, with 24 of 60 men becoming casualties during the advance and withdrawal. Medical records provide additional insights into the nature of combat at Port Hudson. Assistant Surgeon James Wilson noted in his report, wounds among the colored troops were predominantly to the anterior aspects of the body, chest, abdomen, and face, suggesting they maintained forward orientation toward enemy fire throughout the engagement. This pattern was not consistently observed among all units engaged on that day. In the aftermath of Port Hudson, several officers who had commanded black troops wrote assessments that circulated through Union command channels. Colonel Thomas Higginson of the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, another black regiment, referenced Port Hudson in correspondence with the War Department. The performance of the Louisiana regiments confirms what we have observed with our own troops. Given adequate training and leadership, colored soldiers maintain discipline under fire and execute orders with precision. The persistent notion that they lack courage or steadiness has been thoroughly disproven. Not all assessments were favorable. A report submitted by a colonel from a New York regiment questioned, "While the colored troops at Port Hudson conducted themselves adequately, I maintain reservations about their general deployment in offensive operations. Their temporary refusal to withdraw when ordered suggests an imperfect understanding of tactical necessity and raises concerns regarding discipline under adverse circumstances." This critical assessment fails to acknowledge the unique context in which the Native Guards operated, a context well understood by the men themselves. As Sergeant William Johnson wrote to his former master after the battle, "We could not retreat when first ordered, for it would have confirmed what so many believed, that we would break under fire. Better to die advancing than live with such a judgment. When we did withdraw, we did so as soldiers, not as runaways. The psychological burden carried by these soldiers emerges clearly in such personal accounts. They fought not just against Confederate forces, but against deeply entrenched prejudice within their own army. Each action was performed with an awareness that they represented not just themselves, but an entire people, with consequences extending far beyond the immediate tactical situation. The story of Port Hudson's significance continued to evolve through 1864 and 65. As more black regiments entered combat, their officers often explicitly referenced Port Hudson during training and before engagements. A lieutenant with the 54th Massachusetts, preparing his company before the assault on Fort Wagner, was reported to have told his men, "Remember what the Louisiana men did at Port Hudson. They proved what colored troops can do under fire. Tonight, we will do the same." Perhaps the most significant legacy of Port Hudson appears in recruitment materials from late 1863 through 1865. A broadside distributed in Philadelphia in October 1863 states, "At Port Hudson, colored soldiers advanced further toward enemy works than any white regiment engaged that day. They have proven in blood what many doubted, that they possess all qualities required of American soldiers. Join their ranks and continue this proud tradition." By war's end, approximately 179,000 black men had served in the Union Army, constituting roughly 10% of all Union forces. Their participation had evolved from an experiment viewed with skepticism to a military necessity, acknowledged even by those who had initially opposed their enlistment. A War Department assessment completed in April 1865 concluded, "The recruitment and deployment of colored troops has been a military success by any objective measure." Beginning with isolated engagements, such as Port Hudson, and gradually expanding to general combat operations, these soldiers have performed all duties required of them, often under circumstances made more difficult by prejudice and inadequate support. The most profound testament to what occurred at Port Hudson comes not from official reports or military assessments, but from the men themselves. In a letter dated August 1863, Corporal Henry Adams of the 3rd Louisiana Native Guards wrote to his former schoolteacher in New Orleans, "What happened at Port Hudson was a beginning, not an end. We have shown what is possible, but much remains to be proven. The path to true equality stretches far beyond this battlefield, yet what was demonstrated here cannot be undone or denied. We stood our ground when ordered to retreat, not from disobedience, but from understanding that some moments in history require more than blind obedience. In that ravine, we claimed our place as soldiers and as men." After the war, veterans of the Native Guards held annual reunions in New Orleans until the late 1880s, when the imposition of Jim Crow laws and the general deterioration of race relations in the South made such gatherings increasingly difficult and dangerous. The last recorded reunion occurred in 1887, with 34 veterans in attendance. A toast offered at that final gathering was recorded by a journalist from a black newspaper. "To Port Hudson, where we proved what had always been true but seldom acknowledged, that courage, discipline, and love of country are qualities that know no color. Though many have tried to forget what happened there, we who stood in that ravine will carry its truth to our graves." The Battle of Port Hudson gradually faded from public consciousness, overshadowed by larger engagements and the tumultuous events of Reconstruction. Military historians continued to study the siege for its tactical and strategic significance, but the psychological breakthrough represented by the Native Guards' refusal to retreat received less attention than it deserved. It would be nearly a century before the full significance of what those men accomplished would be widely acknowledged. A military historian writing in 1963 observed, "The Port Hudson campaign represents one of those rare moments when military necessity and moral imperative briefly aligned, creating an opportunity for marginalized people to demonstrate their humanity through extraordinary courage." The native guards' refusal to retreat when first ordered, technically an act of insubordination, transformed through context into something profoundly different, forced a reluctant acknowledgement of their value as soldiers and, by extension, as citizens. The sound of that proof continues to echo through American military history, sometimes faintly, sometimes distorted by those uncomfortable with its implications. But for those who listen carefully, the message from that ravine before Port Hudson remains clear. Courage knows no color, and the will to prove one's humanity can sustain men through fire that would break those with less at stake. In military terms, the significance of Port Hudson extends beyond the tactical outcome of that particular engagement. What the Louisiana Native Guards demonstrated there, that black soldiers would maintain discipline and cohesion under the most adverse combat conditions, influenced Union military policy for the remainder of the war. Their performance helped transform the recruitment of black soldiers from a controversial experiment to a strategic necessity, ultimately bringing nearly 200,000 men into the Union ranks at a critical juncture in the conflict. But the deeper significance lies in how these soldiers understood their own actions. They recognized that they fought on two fronts simultaneously, against Confederate forces and against the prejudice that surrounded them in their own army. Their refusal to retreat when first ordered represented not a failure of discipline, but an intuitive understanding that in that moment military necessity had to be balanced against a larger imperative. The need to conclusively demonstrate their worth as soldiers and as men. Private Thomas Jackson, writing to his wife 2 weeks after the battle, expressed this dual awareness. "The white officers thought we might break and run under fire. We knew we could not, whatever came. Death would have been preferable to confirming what they believed about us. So we advanced when ordered and held when others fell back. When we finally withdrew, we did so in good order, carrying our wounded. Even those who doubt us could not deny what they saw with their own eyes." The legacy of Port Hudson can be traced through subsequent deployments of black regiments throughout the war. At Milliken's Bend, Chaffin's Farm, Olustee, and dozens of other engagements, black soldiers continued to demonstrate the qualities first conclusively proven at Port Hudson. By war's end, 16 black soldiers had received the Congressional Medal of Honor for extraordinary courage in combat. In a broader sense, what happened at Port Hudson represents a crucial moment in the long struggle for equality. A moment when men who had been legally classified as property only months before seized an opportunity to demonstrate their humanity in terms that even the most prejudiced observers could not entirely dismiss. They understood intuitively that such opportunities were rare and must be seized at any cost. The siege of Port Hudson concluded on July 9, 1863. The Mississippi River was now completely under Union control, a strategic objective of the highest importance. But for the men of the Louisiana Native Guards, something of perhaps equal importance had been accomplished. They had written themselves into the military history of their nation, not as laborers or support troops, but as soldiers who advanced when ordered, held when tested, and withdrew with discipline when the tactical situation required it. As Sergeant William Johnson wrote in his diary on July 10th, the day after Port Hudson's surrender, "What was gained here cannot be measured merely in ground taken or strategic advantage. We have changed something fundamental in how we are seen, and more importantly, in how we see ourselves. The road ahead remains long, but it has been proven beyond question that we can walk it as soldiers and as men." The most enduring testimony to what occurred at Port Hudson comes from those who stood in that ravine, facing concentrated Confederate fire, weighing the order to withdraw against the imperative to prove their worth. Their decision in that moment, to hold their ground until the purpose of the withdrawal was clarified, then to execute the maneuver with disciplined precision, demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of both military necessity and the larger historical context in which they operated. They recognized that their actions would be judged by different standards than those applied to white troops, and that the consequences of those judgments would extend far beyond their individual fates. In choosing to prioritize the demonstration of their courage and discipline over strict adherence to orders, they made a calculation that history has vindicated. The engagement at Port Hudson represents one of those pivotal moments when the course of history turns on the actions of ordinary people placed in extraordinary circumstances. The men of the Louisiana Native Guards, many of whom had been denied even the most basic human rights throughout their lives, seized an opportunity to demonstrate their humanity in terms that could not be denied or dismissed. In doing so, they advanced not just toward Confederate fortifications, but toward a future in which their full citizenship and humanity might eventually be recognized. The ground they gained in that advance cannot be measured in yards or miles, but in the slow, painful evolution of American society toward a more perfect recognition of the humanity of all its people. The sound of their footsteps, advancing in good order under fire, continues to echo. For those who listen carefully, the message remains clear. Courage knows no color, discipline transcends social status, and the determination to be recognized as fully human can sustain men through challenges that would break those with less at stake. As Private John Williams wrote to his family after the surrender, what we did here will be remembered, not just by us, but by those who doubted us. The road ahead remains long, but it has been proven beyond question that we can walk it as soldiers and as men.